Stephanie White gives makes me feel she's out of touch with what actual fans are thinking and feeling and experiencing and going through. She was asked, hey, the pushback that you received after sitting Caitlin Clark about an hour and a half before game timer, were you surprised by that pushback? She had the audacity to say yes. Great question, but she said yes. Wait, you...
The Indiana Fever just handed us the most accidentally revealing 10 minutes of audio we've heard all season. And no, it didn't come from a locker room leak or a hot mic situation. It came from their own head coach sitting down willingly for a local radio interview. What Stephanie White said during that conversation didn't just raise eyebrows. It genuinely shook a fan base that was already hanging on by a thread. Because when a polite, respectful radio host lobbed her the easiest possible question about why fans were upset over the sudden scratching of Caitlin Clark from the lineup, her answer wasn't some careful...
Put his hand on her shoulder, threw some folders in front of her, some graphs in front of her, saying, hey, this needs to change here. Do you see this attendance? Yeah, this isn't too good. Do you see this fan engagement because of how we're going about things? Yeah, this isn't too good. Do you see these... Now, I'm all for you coaching, Stephanie, but I'm also all for my moolah. And some of the things that you're saying in these interviews has directly impacted my bottom line.
Fully crafted acknowledgement. It wasn't empathy. It wasn't even a basic I hear you. It was surprise. Genuine, audible surprise that fans were even bothered. And that single word, that reaction of shock, lit an absolute firestorm across the internet that the Fever front office is still desperately trying to contain right now.
Minute scratch, if you will. You know, I went back and saw, and I think it was on May 9th, you had made comment almost foreshadowing, I don't mean that, but you know, that, hey, there are certain areas in a player where there's going to be the occasional game like that, right? I mean, there are going to be tweaks that happen over the course of a season with the player. Were you surprised by the scrutiny that came with her missing a game?
I was. I mean, it happens all the time. And in fact, I think Kevin Durant was a late scratch for game one of the first round of the playoffs. So, you know.
All right.
But what most people haven't done yet is actually sit down and pull this entire interview apart piece by piece. Because when you do, what you find isn't just one bad answer. It's a pattern. A deeply alarming pattern that exposes just how wide the gap has grown between this coaching staff and the millions of fans fueling...
I mean, it's the nature of sport. And I think those who haven't been an athlete, those who haven't been injured, those who haven't gone through the rigors of what it means to go through the process of being a professional athlete, let alone coming back from injury. I mean, there are things that flare up all the time. And so I was surprised, but, you know, we talk to our players all the time about...
Now, everything she just stated there...
The most explosive era in franchise history. So let's break down every single moment. Because trust me, it gets so much worse than that first answer. Let's rewind to May 20th because that's where this whole firestorm actually ignited. Caitlin Clark, the single biggest draw in women's basketball and arguably the most marketable athlete in any American sports league right now, was completely absent from the official injury report on Tuesday. That's important. The injury report existed. Her name was nowhere on it. What's even more bizarre is that she did
only to repeat the same mistake this year. She wasn't participating in practice Tuesday prior to the game, not listed on the injury report. Then Wednesday, an hour and a half before game time, she's listed on the injury report out after fans already spent their money. It has nothing to do about her being banged up and things flaring up. It has everything to do with the shadiness surrounding the timeline of the injury. It has everything to do with surrounding, well, she wasn't listed on Tuesday, yet on Wednesday, an hour and a half before the game, she's a scratch.
Didn't even participate in the team's practice session that same Tuesday, and yet absolutely nobody from the organization reported that crucial detail to the media or the public. Then on Wednesday, roughly 90 minutes before the official tip-off against Portland, an announcement suddenly appeared out of thin air. Caitlin Clark was officially listed as out due to back injury. 90 minutes. That's how much warning thousands of dedicated fans received after they had already spent their hard-earned cash on tickets. After families from out of town,
Your offense. Stephanie White is my guest. She's the head coach of the Indiana Fever. They take on Golden State tomorrow night. Pregame at 9:30. The game is at 10 o'clock. I think I said the Fieldhouse. It's obviously on the road. But, Coach, when you look at your offense, and maybe it varies from play to play, but more often than not, who is your first offensive option?
Our first offensive option is usually Caitlin Clark, but it's in different ways.
No, she didn't.
had already booked hotels and made travel arrangements, after people had already forked over absurd prices for downtown parking. Those fans walked through the doors of the Fieldhouse completely dressed in their Clark jerseys, only to discover that the once-in-a-generation talent they paid premium prices to see wasn't even going to be on the bench in uniform. And here's the part that makes this so much more infuriating. This was not a new...
I'm not trying to call you out on this. Stephanie White is my guest, the head coach of the Indiana Fever. You know, here you are, scoring champion, Indiana Miss Basketball, national champion, Purdue, you name it, right? And yet, Sunday was your very first Indianapolis 500. Now, I'm glad you went,
I know,
and I'll give you, but that stuns me.
That is very shameful. Y'all ain't just hear everything he just named off. He named off hella shit, bro. And that was your first time. Why you come ish on Caitlin Day, bro?
First.
Damn, and I think John is actually onto something here. Your first Indy 500
problem. This was not some unprecedented organizational hiccup that nobody could have predicted. Throughout the entire 2025 season, when Clark was limited to just 13 games due to a string of injuries, the Fever caught relentless heat from media and fans alike for their misleading, vague, and painfully late injury communications. It became its own scandal. National sports talk radio hammered them for weeks. The criticism was loud, it was specific, and it was everywhere. So the massive unspoken promise heading into this brand new season was simple. This would never happen. The organization had learned its lesson. Transparency would be the new standard. And then the very first real injury situation of the new year unfolded.
100 is the one that Caitlin's there for? Huh. Your first Indy 500 is as a tag-along on Caitlin's big day. You had all of this time, Miss Indiana, Indiana basketball, Purdue, yada, 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 yada. You used to be a coach, you even played for the team. And this is your first Indy 500? Very interesting. Very interesting. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Like the video, hype the video, and subscribe to the channel. That would mean so much to me. Hit the notification bell.
Folded with the exact same sloppy fingerprints all over it. Missed practice on Tuesday. No public disclosure. Status flipped from clean to out inside a 90-minute window. The WNBA itself actually stepped in and issued an official warning to the Fever for violating the league's injury reporting policies. Let that sink in. The league had to formally reprimand them. And somehow it gets even shadier. Reports started surfacing that the Fever actually revoked the press credentials of a reporter who attempted to provide real-time context about Clark's absence. The organization reportedly cited the spread of inaccurate information as their justification, which feels an awful lot like punishing a journalist for doing his job. That's not transparency. That's damage control disguised as discipline. And what happened next during that radio interview would only make things worse. So there sits Stephanie White on live local radio, and the host gives her the most generous setup imaginable. He essentially asks her, "Were you surprised by the backlash?" And instead of acknowledging that, yeah, the communication was handled poorly and the fans had every right to be frustrated, she reaches for a comparison. She brings up Kevin Durant. Out of every possible example in the long, rich history of professional basketball, that's the name she pulls out to defend how the Fever handled this situation. She references how Durant was a late scratch before a first-round playoff game, as if to say, see, this happens everywhere, no big deal. And look, if you glance at that comparison on the absolute surface level without any context whatsoever, it almost sounds reasonable. Star player ruled out late, fans disappointed, it happens. Right? Wrong, because the context between those two situations couldn't be more wildly different. Kevin Durant's rest was a well-known, fully anticipated, strategically communicated decision to protect a veteran superstar heading into the playoffs. His team was resting him in a completely meaningless final regular season game. The fans walking into that arena already knew his status was heavily uncertain. Their expectations had already been adjusted well in advance. Nobody was blindsided. Nobody wasted hundreds of dollars showing up specifically to see him play only to find out at the last possible second that he wasn't suiting up. What happened in Indianapolis was the polar opposite of that. There was zero advanced communication, zero transparency. Fans were deliberately or negligently left in the dark until the final possible moment. The two situations share literally nothing in common beyond the most shallow surface-level detail that a famous player didn't play. The fact that White confidently deployed that comparison on live radio, clearly believing it would calm people down, tells you everything about how she's processing fan frustration right now. She's not hearing it, she's not absorbing it, She's deflecting it with comparisons that crumble under 5 seconds of actual thought. And instead of correcting course when the comparison clearly didn't land, she doubled down with something even more alienating. When the radio host gently pressed her further on the injury timeline and the fan frustration, White pivoted to a defense that coaches have been leaning on since the dawn of professional sports. She essentially implied that the average fan simply doesn't understand what it's like to be a professional athlete. She talked about the physical rigors, the process of coming back from injury, the things that flare up during a grueling season. She leaned into the idea that unless you've personally experienced the demands of elite-level competition, you really aren't in a position to critique how these situations are managed. And fine, sure, let's actually give her that entire argument completely. Every single fan in Indianapolis can freely and happily admit they've never played professional basketball at an elite WNBA level. Nobody is disputing that. But here's the critical thing she keeps missing, and honestly, it's alarming that she keeps missing it. The fans are not upset that Caitlin Clark sat out a game. Players get hurt, bodies break down. Everyone with even a passing knowledge of sports understands that reality. The fury, the real white-hot anger that exploded across social media and sports radio was entirely about the timeline. It was about the secrecy. It was about the feeling of being deliberately kept in the dark by an organization that already burned this exact bridge just 1 season ago. When you wave the "you've never been an athlete" card in response to fans who are upset about communication failures, you're not answering their actual complaint. You're dismissing it. You're telling them their frustration doesn't count because they haven't walked in your shoes. And that condescending pivot might work in a closed-door locker room setting. But on live radio, aimed directly at the thousands of people who fund your franchise with their wallets, it lands like a slap in the face. The fans needed empathy. They needed ownership of the mistake. Instead, they got a lecture about how they couldn't possibly understand. But somehow, the next segment of this interview managed to be even more telling. The radio host shifted the conversation toward the actual basketball, and he asked White a straightforward question. Who is your first offensive option? Now, context is absolutely everything here. Through the first 5 games of the season, Caitlin Clark had been putting up career-high numbers. We're talking about 23.8 points and 9 assists per game. She was undeniably operating as the engine that made the entire Indiana offense function. The numbers were staggering. The eye test backed it up completely. There was no ambiguity whatsoever about who was driving this team offensively. So when the question was asked, the correct answer should have been the easiest layup of the entire interview. Just say it. Say her name with confidence, reassure the fans, end the controversy. Instead, White answered with, "Our first offensive option is usually Caitlin Clark." Usually. That one single qualifying word did an absolutely enormous amount of damage in the span of about half a second. Because remember, this is the same coach who spent the entire offseason and the opening weeks of the current campaign consistently framing the offensive identity around veteran guard Kelsey Mitchell. Other players on the roster had even gone on the record publicly stating that the team sets were heavily designed to feature Mitchell. So when White finally sits down and is given the golden opportunity to firmly, clearly, and definitively tell the fan base that yes, this team runs through Caitlin Clark, she hedges. She qualifies. She softens it with a word that introduces doubt into a statement that desperately needed to radiate total certainty. The whole answer felt rehearsed in the worst possible way. It sounded exactly like a corporate PR team had coached her to finally say the right words, but she couldn't quite bring herself to deliver them with full conviction. It was damage control spoken through clenched teeth, and the fans, who have been begging for months to hear their coach fully commit to building around their generational talent, heard that hesitation loud and clear. That word usually echoed across every Fever fan forum, every group chat, every comment section within minutes. Because in a moment that called for an emphatic absolutely, they got a reluctant usually. And then, almost as if the universe was writing a script nobody would believe, the interview delivered one final moment that crystallized everything. Near the tail end of the conversation, the radio host shifted to some lighter local talk. The Indianapolis 500 had just taken place, which is easily one of the biggest single-day sporting events on the entire planet and the undeniable cultural heartbeat of the city. The topic came up naturally because Caitlin Clark had attended the race and was essentially treated as the celebrity headliner of the whole event. So the host casually asked White if she'd made it out to the track. She said yes, she'd been there, and then the host, keeping his tone perfectly friendly but clearly a little stunned, dropped a simple follow-up. He pointed out that this was her very first Indianapolis 500, her first one ever. Now think about who we're talking about here. This is the former Indiana Miss Basketball, a Purdue University legend, a scoring champion who built her entire career inside the borders of this state. A woman who has coached and played basketball in Indiana for decades. Someone who was born and raised in the absolute epicenter of American basketball culture, quite literally down the road from one of the most iconic racetracks on earth. And in all those years, all those decades of living and breathing Indiana sports, she had never once made it out to the 500. Until this year. The exact year that Caitlin Clark happened to be the main attraction. Now look, taken entirely on its own, that's honestly just a mildly quirky personal detail. Plenty of Indiana natives have never been to the race. Life gets busy, schedules conflict, tickets are expensive. In isolation, it's absolutely not a scandal. But this detail didn't land in isolation. It landed at the very end of an interview that had already painted a vivid portrait of a coach who keeps getting blindsided by things her fan base considers completely obvious. She was surprised fans were upset about a last-minute scratch. She was surprised her weak Kevin Durant comparison didn't smooth things over. She defaulted to dismissing fans as people who have never been athletes. She hedged on calling her best player the #1 option. And now, to cap it all off, it turns out her first ever trip to the single most iconic event in her own city happened to coincide with the exact day her rookie superstar was the star attraction there. Every single beat of that interview stacked on top of the last one like bricks in a wall. And that wall tells one very clear story. The head coach of the Indiana Fever is operating in a completely different reality than the people filling those arena seats every single game night. But before we go any further, we absolutely have to talk about what's actually happening on the basketball court. Because fairness matters. And the truth might surprise you. Near the tail end of the conversation, the radio host shifted to some lighter local talk. The Indianapolis 500 had just taken place, which is easily one of the biggest single-day sporting events on the entire planet and the undeniable cultural heartbeat of the city. The topic came up naturally because Caitlin Clark had attended the race and was essentially treated as the celebrity headliner of the whole event. So the host casually asked White if she'd made it out to the track. She said yes, she'd been there, and then the host, keeping his tone perfectly friendly but clearly a little stunned, dropped a simple follow-up. He pointed out that this was her very first Indianapolis 500, her first one ever. Now think about who we're talking about here. This is the former Indiana Miss Basketball, a Purdue University legend, a scoring champion who built her entire career inside the borders of this state. A woman who has coached and played basketball in Indiana for decades. Someone who was born and raised in the absolute epicenter of American basketball culture, quite literally down the road from one of the most iconic racetracks on earth. And in all those years, all those decades of living and breathing Indiana sports, she had never once made it out to the 500. Until this year, the exact year that Caitlin Clark happened to be the main attraction. Now look, taken entirely on its own, that's honestly just a mildly quirky personal detail. Plenty of Indiana natives have never been to the race. Life gets busy, schedules conflict, tickets are expensive. In isolation, it's absolutely not a scandal. But this detail didn't land in isolation. It landed at the very end of an interview that had already painted a vivid portrait of a coach who keeps getting blindsided by things her fan base considers completely obvious. She was surprised fans were upset about a last-minute scratch. She was surprised her weak Kevin Durant comparison didn't smooth things over. She defaulted to dismissing fans as people who have never been athletes. She hedged on calling her best player the #1 option. And now, to cap it all off, it turns out her first ever trip to the single most iconic event in her own city happened to coincide with the exact day her rookie superstar was the star attraction there. Every single beat of that interview stacked on top of the last one like bricks in a wall. And that wall tells one very clear story. The head coach of the Indiana Fever is operating in a completely different reality than the people filling those arena seats every single game night. But before we go any further, we absolutely have to talk about what's actually happening on the basketball court. Because fairness matters, and the truth might surprise you. The real frustration eating away at this fan base has always been rooted in something much deeper than box scores and win-loss records. It's about trust. It's about transparency. It's about the deeply unsettling feeling that the people running this franchise, from the corporate offices to the coaching staff, fundamentally don't understand why millions of new viewers suddenly started tuning in, or what those specific fans desperately want to see when they flip on the broadcast. And the financial stakes behind this disconnect are genuinely staggering. Before Caitlin Clark was drafted, the Indiana Fever were valued at roughly $90 million. A respectable number, sure, but nothing that would turn heads in the broader sports ownership world. Fast forward to today, and that same franchise is reportedly valued at over $560 million with annual revenue north of $50 million. That's not gradual growth. That's an overnight explosion driven almost entirely by one player's gravitational pull on the culture. Herb Simon, the longtime owner who has patiently overseen decades of modest, quiet returns on the WNBA side of his portfolio, is now suddenly sitting on top of a genuine goldmine. Unprecedented corporate sponsorship deals are flooding in. Road game television ratings are single-handedly dragging the entire league's broadcast numbers to historic heights. Merchandise sales have obliterated every previous record. Opposing arenas that used to draw maybe 4,000 fans on a good night are now completely sold out whenever the Fever come to town. But here's the terrifying reality that ownership absolutely knows, even if they'll never say it publicly. That window of mainstream attention, that once-in-a-lifetime cultural moment, does not stay open automatically. It requires active nurturing. It demands that the paying fans feel respected, valued, and heard by the organization they're pouring their money into. If those passionate supporters in Indianapolis ever genuinely start to feel like the live arena experience isn't worth the increasingly steep price tag, if families start deciding it's easier and cheaper to just watch from the couch, if those massive season ticket renewal numbers start quietly slipping downward, or if the broadcast partners who are paying record-breaking rights fees start openly questioning whether the Fever can actually sustain this historic ratings surge, the financial consequences will hit fast and they will hit hard. And every single tone-deaf radio interview, every dismissive press conference answer, every botched injury communication brings that tipping point a little bit closer. So here we sit, watching a franchise caught in the strangest possible contradiction. The basketball is getting better. The results on the floor are trending in the right direction. Caitlin Clark looks more liberated and dominant with each passing game. The raw product is genuinely exciting to watch. And yet somehow, the organizational trust between this team and its fan base feels like it's cracking wider with every public appearance from the coaching staff. Stephanie White now faces a defining crossroad that will determine not just her future, but potentially the entire trajectory of this historic franchise. She can keep defaulting to shock and confusion every time legitimate fan complaints are raised. She can keep reaching for comparisons that disintegrate under the lightest scrutiny. She can keep qualifying her support for her best player with hesitant, carefully hedged language that satisfies nobody. Or she can finally take a step back, absorb the reality of the moment she's been handed, and actually learn to read the room. This fan base isn't asking for anything unreasonable. They want basic transparency around injuries. They want their coach to say with full, unshakable conviction that the team is being built around Caitlin Clark. They want to feel like the organization respects their time, their money, and their emotional investment in this team. And yeah, on a purely cultural level, they probably expect the head coach of the Indiana Fever to have experienced the biggest sporting event in her own city at least once before her star player made it trendy. None of those expectations are outrageous. None of them are entitled. They're the bare minimum for an organization sitting on top of a $500 million franchise fueled almost entirely by fan passion. The encouraging news buried beneath all of this chaos is that the on-court product genuinely is improving at a rapid clip. Simply letting Caitlin Clark play like the dominant force she was born to be naturally heals a lot of organizational wounds. Stacking up wins will quiet a lot of the noise. And a deep, electrifying playoff run later this year could potentially make everyone forget this entire messy chapter ever happened. But until that happens, until the wins pile up high enough to drown out the frustration, every single press conference and every single radio appearance is a live wire. And right now, it honestly feels like every time Stephanie White steps up to a microphone to defend her process, she's accidentally making an already impossibly difficult job even harder for herself, even more stressful for her young players, and significantly more complicated for the long-term health of a franchise that should be celebrating the greatest era it has ever known. The basketball is finally speaking for itself on the court. The real question is whether the people running the show off the court will ever learn to stop talking over it.